If you can see on your screen there, um, we have three wonderful people that have given their time to speak tonight, and we greatly appreciate that, especially in the evening. We have Lisa Burnside, the Chief Administrative Officer at Hamilton Conservation Authority. Thank you very much for being here, Lisa, and for helping us get sorted earlier, getting everybody into the meeting. um, Councillor Brad Clark, Chair of the Hamilton Conservation Authority. Thank you, Brad. Very much appreciated you jumping from meeting to meeting. And I saw Tony Morris earlier, who is the Conservation Policy and Campaigns Director at Ontario Nature, which is an exceptionally well-known organization here in Ontario. Thank you very much for being here and giving us the time that this very, very important subject, which has been put and forced in front of us. As many of us understand, we are sitting on the cusp of a potential amalgamation of, let's just call it many, many conservation authorities into very few conservation authorities. Part of that would mean Hamilton Conservation Authority would potentially be joining with Niagara and moving all the way around into credit as well, and possibly others beyond that. The biggest issue, as everybody can imagine here, is that we see a unfortunate but never-ending stripping of powers of the wonderful people that work for, around, and with, and cooperate with the conservation authorities. For many that are not aware of the history of conservation authorities, after Hurricane Hazel, there was a very, very strong movement, this was back in the 50s, to move and create this watershed management approach to conservation. And that's where the conservation authorities came from. And obviously it is their intimate and extremely scientifically backed, evidence-based resources that have such an amazing amount of local knowledge that we are so desperately thankful for and want to preserve. So we thought that we might begin by asking some questions to our wonderful speakers. And since they are the people of the hour, I'm going to stop sharing this screen here so that we can hopefully then queue on. And I'm going to start with Councillor Brad Clark. Brad, if you don't mind, what are your concerns about the dismantling and reconstruction of the conservation authorities in Ontario and the Hamilton area? And what are the unknowns, or let's call them uncertainties, at this point?
Thank you for that, Peter. So the main concern that I hear frequently is the loss or erosion of local autonomy. And let me explain how that is coming about. So if Hamilton is now merged with the Niagara, Halton, and Credit Valley Conservation Authorities, there will always be 3 conservation authorities that will have more control over Hamilton. In Hamilton right now, we have our board of directors. It's a very clear board of directors with wonderful citizens and councillors sitting on it. In the new structure, doesn't really matter how it is structured. Each of the conservation authorities will be relegated to being one of 4 conservation authorities. And so we will need to convince the other 3 conservation authorities to assist us or to support our initiative. Let me give you an example. Not all conservation authorities in the province, as a matter of fact, very few, are regularly acquiring conservation lands. The Hamilton Conservation Authority does that as long as we have the funds. And we heard from the province that all lands, all assets, all offices, everything will be rolled up into the new regional conservation authority. So we've already had a casualty as a result of this provincial initiative. The HCA had proposed to the city of Hamilton a special levy of $500,000 per year for 10 years, giving us $5 million to purchase new lands. Because of the ministry statement, that special levy has now been deferred because we don't know whether or not we're going to have control over those reserves. Second issue is the large-scale regional consolidation. It will introduce substantial transition costs and it'll divert resources away from frontline watershed programs. As someone who went through the amalgamation in Hamilton, I can tell you that the costs went up. They did not go down. So there is no savings as a result of amalgamation into a larger entity. It will also disrupt longstanding community partnerships. And what I mean by that is the HCA has a wonderful membership group. We have tremendous donors and partners through the Conservation Foundation. We have many partnerships with many agencies and groups that operate around the city, helping to preserve environment and conservation initiatives. If we get merged into this larger regional conservation authority, their voices will be weakened. Their voices will become smaller, if you will. I could go on, but I know I have other colleagues that, and there will be other questions. So those are some of the top ones right off the bat, Peter.
Yeah, you certainly nailed it there, and I really appreciate you bringing up a lot of those points. There are never-ending concerns about, shall we say, spreading the butter a little bit too thin on the bread there, and I appreciate that, and there's definitely much more I'd like to hear from you as we move along here. I'll move to Mr. Morris here, and we would really love to hear what has been the response of Ontario Nature, and what have you been hearing at Ontario Nature from the great following that you have developed there? What concerns are you hearing, and what concerns does Ontario Nature have specifically?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So Ontario Nature, with our nature network groups and partners across the province, main concerns with this are really this gets away from the core premise of why conservation authorities were set up to be local watershed managers. So this proposal completely contradicts the real unique system that exists in Ontario to protect our communities from flooding and erosion, but also to maintain, important natural areas close to our communities. And it's really part of a broader pattern we're seeing with this government of weakening environmental protections, including previous changes to the roles of conservation authorities in 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2024. So again, as the risk of flooding only increases in our communities, this is really the wrong direction to take power away from and expertise away from local communities, centralizing it at the provincial level and politicizing it. The agency they're proposing to create at the provincial level, the minister would basically be able to provide direction, and politicizing it. So again, takes away that local expertise. And really the lack of transparency of how the government's gone about this. The changes to create that new centralized provincial agency were buried as part of an omnibus budget bill that was passed without committee hearings late last year. And while the government is separately consulting through the environmental registry on this proposal to consolidate the conservation authorities, they didn't even reference that bill. So, again, there's a really kind of erosion of Ontarians' environmental rights through the Environmental Bill of Rights. And again, this kind of attack on the conservation authorities that's the government says is to accelerate housing, but yet their own housing affordability task force never identified conservation authorities as a barrier to housing. All the recommendations were related to municipalities. So, and all the changes we've seen to the Planning Act and conservation authorities, or in a state where Ontario's housing starts are lower than they've ever been. So all these changes are not doing anything to address what the government is setting there for.
Yeah, that's an excellent point that you're raising there, especially at the end. I mean, not only do we sit upon an erosion of more environmental protections, but at the worst possible time, it really in the history of conservation in this area. Just quickly, I thought I would ask, as a very quick follow-up, are you hearing also anything surrounding, just because we've been hearing it as well, around not just obviously the issue that goes with flooding and flood protections, but also potential issues with water quality in the future, drinking water quality, et cetera, if that's coming across your desk too?
Yeah, it is. I think with some of the other things we're seeing in changes, and there's a proposal again late last year to allow private water corporations. And again, there's been Waterloo Region's a perfect example. What changes to the permit to take water system is now actually potentially resulting in Waterloo Region not actually having enough water capacity. So, the conservation authorities are watershed experts and watershed managers. So, it is something, water quality, natural area management, natural hazards, those are concerns we're hearing from our nature network groups across the province. And you've seen also many, many municipalities push back against this proposal. So, again, it's not clear who's asking for this and who's supporting this change or why it's needed.
Yeah, exactly. I live in the rural part of Hamilton, and this area, including farmers of all different types and backgrounds, are now in essentially the 6th month of a drought. And as you mentioned, we talk about flood issues, but at the same time as flood issues, we're also dealing with other forms of climate change, which are things like droughts. And if we don't manage the watersheds properly, then things like droughts and recharging aquifers and groundwater tables become even more difficult, right? So a lot of people don't realize that would mean that, simple things like the cost of fruit and vegetables, et cetera, at your local market would go up, because now you're going to have to farm in water to irrigate, et cetera. So it was really interesting how widespread this becomes. I really appreciate your words there. Really exceptional. And then I'd like to move on to our next speaker. And our next speaker is going to be coming across right now. I'm just pulling this up here. There we go. And put up, and so everybody can see who everybody is again. That was Tony Morris, everyone, conservation and nature. We had Brad Clark, Councillor Brad Clark first, and now we have Lisa Burnside, the Chief Administrative Officer at the Hamilton Conservation Authority. Thank you for being here, Lisa. And a lovely question to come straight at you. What might be the impacts on Conservation Authority staff and HCA operations?
Well, thank you, Peter, and happy to be here this evening. Thanks for inviting me. And it's a tough question, And the honest answer is right now, there isn't enough detail to fully understand how staffing or our day-to-day operations might change under a regional model. Now, what we know from consultation sessions and from the minister's October 31st announcement is that local offices are expected to remain open. And the minister himself has publicly stated there will be no job losses as a result of this proposal. When we take a look across the proposed Western Lake Ontario regional CA, each conservation authority has a main office and several specialized sites and satellite offices. Halton's got a ski hill. Hamilton, we have a marina. We've all got campgrounds, and we all have flood and erosion control structures. And we all deliver many local programs and services through agreements with our various participating municipalities. And these services are local by nature and rely on experienced local staff and local knowledge. So, I mean, at this point, what is clear is that there is a new provincial head office, so to speak, that's been created through Bill 68. We now have the Ontario Provincial Conservation Agency, and conservation authorities are going to report into that structure. And I think it's going to take some time to really understand how a regional system would work in practice on the ground if the proposed model moves forward. I'd expect working groups to be formed to work through the multiple issues that any regional amalgamation is going to raise, and we need input from those who know these services best. So in the meantime, all I can say, it's business as usual. Our focus is on continuing our work, supporting our staff, and delivering all of our local programs and services to our watershed residents and communities.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And I know it's, like you said, almost typically vague on many details so far. So it's hard for you to get back to some of these. So maybe if you don't mind, I'll do a quick little follow-up on the back end of this, and just to get your side of this, and then maybe have Brad follow up afterwards. But as many know, or maybe they don't, all conservation authorities are, for the most part, municipally funded through tax dollars through the Greater Hamilton, for instance, for the HCA. So a lot of people are asking, if this is to go through, and let's just say it's somewhere in the 90 percentile of the funds for the HCA come from Greater Hamilton. What do you have any idea what would happen? Is Hamilton still on the bill? Are the taxpayers on the bill, even though you may get one or two possible seats for out of 70 something at Queen's Park? Just thought I'd see if you had heard any more about how that could work.
Peter, my understanding and what I've heard is that the minister has said himself several times, and it's in their documents, the funding model doesn't change. So participating municipalities will still be levied. And currently, most conservation authorities, and I'll speak to HCA, the one I'm with, we self-generate 60% of our budget through our conservation areas, grants, our foundation. Then we have the municipal levy. The province gives us about 1% of our budget. And then, we take a little bit of money from reserves every year. So, I mean, if we're moving to a regional model, then there's going to be a regional budget. So it's going to be a regional board of directors approving a budget. And we really got to see how, details on how that is going to work. Who is appointed to these regional board of directors? How many members will they have? In our Western Lake Ontario proposed region, I believe there's 28 participating municipalities. Right now we have a 10-member board of directors with 10 members from the city of Hamilton, either municipal councillors or citizens, and 1 member from the township of Puslinch. Well, Hamilton's not going to have 10 members on a new regional board of directors. No. So, it's going to be interesting to see, if they move forward, how is this all going to work? And we're one of the smaller amalgamations. If you take a look on either side of us, the Lake Ontario, the Lake Erie Regional Conservation Authority Now you're trying to amalgamate 78 conservation authorities, and you've got over 80 participating municipalities. How do you create a board of directors and an effective governance structure?
Yeah, no, it defies not just logic, but even simple math as to how this could possibly, let's say, save money, as I believe was one of the big reasons for this in the original, shall we call it, press release. Brad, could I move over to you and ask from your side, obviously as a councillor, how you're thinking about this? I know that there was a motion put forward, and just so people can see, I'll bring this motion up here. That was not too long ago. Where are we? Go. So that motion is, let me put it, there it is right here. So everybody can see that now with the share screen, I think. There's a motion moved by Councillor Kassar, seconded by Councillor Wilson, and the City of Hamilton's opposition. In terms of, your expertise, Brad, how likely or how successful have been, let's just call it small, medium, large size amalgamations in your experience, like we've just heard, that have come together on budget?
There is always an expectation by the government that is proposing an amalgamation that the amalgamation will have scales of economy and save money. The challenge is when you're looking at amalgamations in government, and there have been many studies on this, there has not been any savings for many amalgamations. Look at the City of Hamilton, which was amalgamated in 2000. While there were great promises for less taxes and saving money, it went in the other direction. And the challenge is you're creating a much larger organization. So automatically the responsibilities of your senior staff are much larger than a smaller organization. And what tends to happen is that salaries get bumped up significantly. If you look at the salary of a larger conservation authority for a CAO, it's not comparable with some of the smaller CAOs. And so you have that problem right off the bat. The next challenge you have at the HCA, we are very busy dealing with permit applications and stewards and commenting on numerous potential policies. Imagine now there are 4 conservation authorities thrown together, and you have one regional conservation authority who has to do all of that work. That's an enormous amount of work. It's not small potatoes by any extent of the imagination. And so I really feel that the minister and the government, and I don't mean to be a cynic, I think they're listening more to developers than they are to the people who are actually running conservation authorities. I know there are developers who are angry with different conservation authorities and would like to see, I'll use a colloquial term, they'd like to see conservation authorities put in their place. Well, conservation authorities are independent. Conservation authorities have their own local autonomy. Conservation authorities deal with land issues within their watershed. And they, as you indicated, control flooding issues and all of those responsibilities. And we do it very well. And when we start to deal with permit applications, we've heard, that permit applications are not happening. I can tell you that the Hamilton Conservation Authority has already centralized and used technology to our advantage to improve our ability to respond to applications in a timely manner. In 2024, we hit 94%. 94% of all of our applications were done well within the time frame. So it's a little bit erroneous to hear some of the comments coming out of the government that they're trying to fix this problem when I would suggest we don't have a problem.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up some great points, and one of them being that I saw Dawn put in the chat here as well, and was in my list. And I'll just go up and state it that, if the Hamilton Conservation Authority is already making 94% of its planning decisions on time, how is this going to, quote unquote, get shovels in the ground sooner, right?
And I would go further than that. The ramifications of this decision still are unknown, but I can tell you I am already hearing from people who are donors to our conservation foundation, and they are becoming nervous. Would they contribute to a larger regional conservation authority when their onus is their intent has been to support local autonomy, local conservation authorities, and that's a real concern for me. I work hard with Lisa and our staff to reach out to landowners to find exactly the right fit for an acquisition of land. They have real comfort. Landowners have real comfort with the conservation authority and how we deal with them. There is not that comfort with this new proposed regional conservation authority, and it concerns me. I honestly believe that there's someone else that is pushing the buttons for the government, and it's certainly not the people on the ground who are making these decisions, building up our conservation lands, protecting our conservation lands. It seems to be the donors to the PC party are more important than the donors to the conservation foundations.
Yeah, that's a great point. And as you kind of touched on, and maybe I'll go a little bit further, but the simple point is shovels in the ground so far are not being truly restricted at this point in Southern Ontario by conservation authorities. It's whether or not their projections in terms of, the profit that they're looking to seek as a private corporation or whatnot are sufficient enough. And if if the bond market is doing what it's supposed to do, and if the mortgage rates are doing what they're supposed to do, so because there are less startups in terms of new housing in Ontario than there has been in many, many years.
Yes, and it's not, again, to reiterate what you said, Peter, it is not the fault of the conservation authorities. We move heaven and earth to deal with the applications in a timely manner, and we have done that. There are much larger issues for developers than conservation authorities. So I really think that someone's pushing the premier and the minister to do this, and it's certainly not to the benefit of local residents and local conservation authorities.
Thanks so much. I'm going to jump quickly to a question here for our good fellow from Ontario Nature. And quite simply, there are some, shall we say, key details that remain unknown. And I wondered if Ontario Nature has had the opportunity to look a little bit deeper into this in terms of how, and Brad, you did touch on it, but how it will affect the very simple system of governance and costs affected, but also how are we going to be able to find local donors? How are we going to find those people? And is this not potentially another way to push away those donors so that, like you said, they feel some fear and go, well, I guess I'm not going to go and bequeath X or Y or sell X or Y to their conservation authority. And maybe you could touch on that a little bit further if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, like Brad and Lisa have said, there's just too many unknowns with this proposal in terms of like the governance structure, the funding, that sort of thing. They say it's not going to change, but it's the Lisa referenced the Lake Erie proposed Lake Erie Regional Conservation Authority. It's 8 CAs that would be combined into one, responsible for 81 different municipalities. Um, that that's just going to cause more confusion. On the like land acquisition, that side of things, land in Southern Ontario is already incredibly expensive. It's incredibly difficult to do private land acquisition for conservation. Ontario Nature is a land trust that owns lands as well. There is a role for organizations like that, but it is really the most expensive way to do conservation at scale, particularly in Southern Ontario. Again, when the provincial share of funding to CAs, like Lisa said, it's only 1% for Hamilton Conservation Authority. It's been scaled back for even some of the smaller ones that have been more dependent on provincial funding to a fraction of what it used to be. So really, the public funds that are available for the important work that its conservation authorities need to do is not sufficient for the task at hand. Flooding already is the most costly disaster in Ontario. Insurance premiums are going to continue to go up. These are costs our communities can't afford without provincial help. So under this proposal, none of those questions are answered in terms of how this is actually going to manage natural hazards more effectively and address potential long-term costs to our communities that are already struggling to maintain the infrastructure they have.
Yeah, well,
The GTA floods last year, in 2024, well, that was over $1 billion in insured loss just from that one storm. And that was a year that had 3 100-year storms. Those are storms that are only supposed to happen every 100 years.
Yeah.
So, this is guaranteed to continue to happen.
Yes, and the very fact that you just brought up that one single large storm, and because it's in Toronto, it gets lots of extra attention. But in the last 18 years, there's been an 8-fold increase in flooding payouts by insurance, which is now at $8.5 billion a year in Canada being paid out. So as you said, the most costly side of this is certainly the flood mitigation and how those powers that are currently sitting in the hands of conservation authorities are so extremely important, and why they need to stay in those hands. I wanted to ask people if they have some questions to please go ahead and put them in a question format in the chat. We would love to hear from you. If for any reason you don't know how to do that, you can also use the react button and raise hand at the bottom, and we can get to you that way. What I was looking at in terms of what we're trying to do in the Hamilton area, and I'm just going to hit the quick share screen here again, because as you'll see, we did have some success with a very recent event, shall we call it, and that was a rally in about minus 15 to 20 wind chill down in Dundas, Ontario on Coots Drive that had 115 plus people show out to fight back against this. And I really want to make sure people understand that the analogy between what we're seeing now and the fight against the Greenbelt grab are very similar in terms of the public pressure that came from all of those rallies across the province, and that were very strong and powerful here in Greater Hamilton and surrounding areas, made a difference. When local, shall we call, the MPPs were receiving, dozens and then hundreds of emails and letters asking Lumsden or Donna Skelly, et cetera, to talk to their boss, shall we say, about this. The reason for our next rally and continuing rallies afterwards, it's quite simple. Bring your signs, make sure that you're emailing and phone calling those local MPPs. And this is wherever you are. I know we have people here listening in from Guelph region, down in St. Thomas, out in Georgetown, etc. Your MP is there to listen to you, and if they hear one call, maybe they'll ignore it. If they hear 5, they start to listen, and it's more than just the administrator picking up the phone. A dozen, 2 dozen, things start to move. So we're happy at, for instance, Save Our Streams to showcase and work with you in your own respective areas to help you also get your own local demonstrations. And those first Greenbelt rallies were 4 or 5 people handing out flyers and turned into hundreds. So I wanted to make sure that we all understood, quite simply, that's the most important way to help. We all know that earlier on we were allowed to comps in through the ERO, and hopefully everybody here was able to do that. Even though the time has passed to do that, it does not mean that you cannot still go ahead and email their general offices and ask them right away. Listen, we are here to push this forward. And I see some great questions coming in here. Is really, really on top of many minds. What can communities do to stop these changes to conservation authorities in Ontario? And that's why I just went through these. Start with whatever size pop-up rally you can get and plan it. Save Our Streams is willing to help you and show you how to make signs, how to set it up, how simple it is to get some baked goods and hot chocolate there, because it's a little chilly out there. And most importantly, what's the best way to make sure that this happens in every single possible way in your own backyard. Now, a lot of people were asking, Hamilton has over 11,000 acres of land. Now, could a regional CA under control of the new provincial board be required to sell off existing lands? I would like to pass that question on to Lisa to start with. Lisa, I'm not sure this is something you've dealt with in the past, but is it possible that HCA could be told, listen, you got a chunk of land over here. To us, it's just some boring old agricultural land across a hedgerow. We want to sell that to the developers. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, so now we're kind of speculating what might happen under a proposed regional model with a regional board of directors, because currently when we look at either acquiring land, which is usually the case, we bring that to our board of directors, and that's approved by the board of directors. So any land acquisition disposition, I would surmise, would have to go to a regional board of directors and would require regional approval. So there would have to be some sort of circumstance. I can't fathom a reason why staff would bring forward such a recommendation. So it's going to be up to a new regional board. Now, what the province has told us is that, our ownership and management of our lands and trails and providing access to green space and recreation education programs, they have said that is not changing. And they've repeated that several times. So with that in mind, I would like to think that all of our lands have purpose. We've acquired them for natural heritage reasons, to protect wetlands. We have some for recreation. We have some for flood and erosion control. So I'd like to think that wouldn't change.
Yeah, and I appreciate, honestly, your insight does help a lot. The regional board, as it sits right now and how it's set up, we've heard the word appointees at a larger provincial, something that into the region you've heard of so far.
So what I've heard is that the new provincial conservation agency, there will be a board of directors, but the board of directors will be decided by orders in council. So those are appointments by cabinet. And with my past history with provincial government, I'm nervous. They're creating this new provincial conservation agency. And they're not telling us how much it's going to cost. They're telling us that the province will fund it for 3 to 5 years, and then it will be downloaded to municipalities. Rumors are that this new office, at least the leaks that I've heard, is about $5 million a year. So if the province appoints, bear me out here, if the premier appoints PC supporters to be on the board of directors of the provincial agency, and then he decides to give that provincial agency more authority over local regional conservation authorities, he can do it. There's nothing stopping him. And the erosion of local autonomy can continue. And so in terms of my experience, and I appreciate letter writing campaigns, but I've my experience at the province has been that letter writing campaigns usually fall on deaf ears. However, if they're getting phone calls at their provincial office and phone calls at their local office, and if the minister's office is being inundated with phone calls and the premier is being inundated with phone calls, then all of a sudden they start to wake up. So that would be, from a government relations standard, how I would recommend that folks who are supporting local autonomy for CAs do that. But Lisa's correct. We do not know. If I am speculating, the province seems to want more control over local conservation authorities. So merge them into regional conservation authorities, create a provincial agency, and then later on we can have the provincial agency control the local conservation authorities. Because as it stands right now, the regional conservation authorities have no say in what the provincial agency does.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. And also any speculation we understand is just that, but it's good to hear somebody with experience give that insight. I've got one here from Lucia, and she's straight up asking, we understand and it's discussed flooding risks. What are the local safeguards that would be remained in place for water quality monitoring? Is that, and has that been outlined in detail outside of their press releases at this point? Maybe Lisa, that you've got maybe the most, let's say, expertise in terms of reading through the documents, might be able to touch on that.
Yeah, so I mean, again, what's lacking in a lot of the material from the province so far is detail. But they have said what's not changing is that, they're going to be maintaining environmental safeguards and our role in natural hazards. So but that's all that they've said. So, I mean, it would require regulatory changes to the act if they want to make further changes. Has the province made changes in the past? I think, yes, Tony, I think you touched on that, and some of your overview you've provided in the last number of years. We've seen changes. We no longer essentially comment on natural heritage matters. That has been put to our municipal partners to handle. But province has said repeatedly that natural hazards will remain in our regulations. So we've got to hold them to that.
Okay, that's really good to hear. And that's really horrible to hear you don't have the same over cultural heritage, etc. But we're here to fight for you to get that back someday. Tony, we had somebody ask about, that some CAs have either been asked or surreptitiously scanned to see if they do have, let's call it quote unquote surplus lands. Is that something that you've heard? I know that because you guys are in, let's call it the work of land acquisition and whatnot, if you've heard anything along those lines, because I was working alongside, which is something that a lot of people have heard, which is good news in Beaver Valley, up in the Collingwood area, where there was a large resort being planned, and the Bruce Trail Conservation Authority ended up buying that land after a long battle. But maybe you could ask if people have been able to, or if you've heard anything along those lines about CAs being scoped for surplus lands.
Yeah, that was something, can't remember if it was last year or 2024 that CAs were asked to do. And to my knowledge, the only CA that actually came forward with any so-called surplus lands is the Grand River Conservation Authority. In discussions we've had with other CAs and our nature network groups across the province, most of the CAs pushed back and said, there's no such thing as surplus conservation land. These are natural hazard lands that are necessary for their various flood mitigation purposes, but also managed as conservation of areas for recreation for community members. So they're not appropriate lands for housing development. That's why they're conservation areas, or are part of the regulation of CAs for natural hazard management. So the only example I'm aware of is the Grand River Conservation Authority, and that's simply they did have quite a bit of land that is currently like agriculture, which again is not ideal. We're losing farmland. That was also part of the pushback against the Greenbelt proposal. We need our farmland just as much as we need our wetlands and forests and meadows.
Peter, to that same point, if I recall correctly, and Lisa can advise me if I have this right, all conservation authorities in Ontario were required to create a land inventory. So an inventory of all the land that they have in their possession. They did not ask us to send it to the ministry. They did not ask us to send it to anyone. They just told us to build the inventory and hold on to it. I think I have that right. Lisa, is that my memory right?
Yes, you're 100% correct. Back with Bill 229, we had a number of deliverables back to the province. We had to make a number of strategies and submit those to the province. And we also were required to create a land inventory, but it was not required to be submitted to the province. We did not submit it to the province, and we did not identify any land that would be suitable for housing, for all the reasons that Tony outlined. The purposes for those lands were not for housing to begin with.
So again, my cynicism, Peter, why did the government ask us to conduct an inventory of all our lands if there wasn't an intention down the road to do something with that inventory?
Well, I'll tell you, I learned this once hard in my business. I had a supplier ask for all my customer lists because they wanted to double over and make sure that we were serving them correctly. And in my naivete, gave them that customer list, and you can imagine what happened with the rest of that situation. how concerned really are you at this point, Brad, that this new, let's call it, or quasi new conservation authority amalgamation will favor developers over protection of our wetlands and conservation land?
It's coming more from my cynicism. So you have a province who has created a new provincial conservation agency. They've announced that they're going to be appointing their own board members. So the local conservation authorities have nothing to do with that. And then in separate posting, they have announced that they're going to merge 36 conservation authorities into 7. Now, just before all of that happened, they asked all those conservation authorities to build up a land inventory, but notes to the ministry, just hold on to that land inventory. And in the meantime, we know from experience that there are developers who are arguing that some conservation lands could be used for housing. And I know from experience in Upper Stony Creek in Hamilton that lands that were close to conservation areas had a 70% increase in value. $70,000 increase in value. So, of course, developers would like to develop lands that are close to conservation authorities, and they would like to argue that some of the buffers that we have are not necessary. So, am I nervous about it? Yes, that would be one way about it. Do I have trepidations? Absolutely. Do I lose sleep at night? Undoubtedly. I fear that there's something going on that we're not aware of, and if we don't increase the opposition in the public, this government will have their way with us.
Yeah, that's really appreciative that you gave that strong support there. I do see that we have MPP Robin Lennox on. Robin, if you're okay with answering a very simple question, are you able to give us any updates, let's call it, from what's happening at Queen's Park, if the chatter that's going on within your party, et cetera? If you're okay with answering that, great. If you're not, I understand completely.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you for hosting this event. I will say, I think Councillor Clark is bringing up some very valid concerns, and they are concerns that are shared absolutely by opposition MPPs. I will say we don't have any further detail than what the government has shared publicly. So especially this government really is not forthright with sort of what their plans are. We sort of have to see them unfold in real time. But what I will say is, we are planning some actions through my office locally. So we will likely be trying to organize sort of another panel and more public facing town hall through my office, sort of hopefully in the next couple of months as we see what we expect to be some further details. We do also have some MPPs, including MPP Sandy Shaw from Hamilton West Ancaster Dundas, who has some petitions active as well, that you can refer people to if they want to get engaged. And then Peter Tabbins is our environmental critic, and will be leading sort of the more province-wide efforts on this. But absolutely, from a personal perspective, I'm very concerned. And I think especially with the narrative right now around trying to sort of eliminate red tape to expedite development, which we know is language that's been used before, including around the Greenbelt. I think it's very important that we draw those parallels in the public between these issues, so that they recognize it's more of a pattern of behavior, even if they're not necessarily as aware of what the role of the conservation authorities are. But we can keep you updated, and we'll make sure if anyone wants to, if you reach out to my office, we'll make sure that you're on the list as we do plan those subsequent events. And again, thanks for everyone for coming tonight.
Amazing. Thank you for your support, Robin. And you've been great and very supportive from the start of this Greenbelt and other issues. So it doesn't go unnoticed. I do have a question here for Tony. Tony at Ontario Nature, I know a big part of what you folks are doing there is obviously preserving every last bit of wetlands we have, which have been for the most part, completely destroyed in southern Ontario. What does this mean for protection of wetlands, of forests, of prairie, and most importantly, endangered species? Because we're also seeing, you know, species being removed from the endangered species list that was present in Ontario.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I guess that the changes since 2018 to Ontario's environmental protections are significant. That will have implications. Lisa spoke to it a bit, and I alluded to it just on the responsibilities of conservation authorities. They used to be able to comment on municipal development applications for things beyond just flooding and erosion. That's no longer the case. As watershed managers, that really kind of goes against watershed science. You can't really look at just flooding and erosion in isolation from water quality, natural cover, different terrestrial and aquatic species that exist in an ecosystem. Like that's how ecology works. You have to look at the system as a whole. But since 2018, there have been 24 bills in Ontario that have weakened environmental legislation, 7 of which have passed just since April 2025, including last year Bill 5, which repeals the Endangered Species Act, which was once considered the gold standard in Canada for species at risk legislation. It's been replaced by a far weaker act. For wetlands specifically, we've seen changes to the Ontario wetland evaluation system that actually makes it harder for wetlands to maintain their provincially significant status. So it really makes it easier for them to lose that status and that protection. And we've already lost over 70% of our wetlands in southern Ontario. And wetlands are flood mitigation powerhouses, climate adaptation powerhouses, and biodiversity hotspots. So those are really vital ecosystems that provide incredible amount of services for far cheaper than what it would cost to build engineered infrastructure to provide those services. So, it is difficult, and people ask me a lot, like, what do we do with a government that doesn't seem willing to listen in the direction that we're going in this day and age in the midst of climate and biodiversity crisis? But the Greenbelt shows that with enough pushback, the government will reverse course. So, I know engaging in politics can seem exhausting and, it can seem futile sometimes, but there are governments like this that are trying to erode democratic rights and democratic processes, environmental legislation, are kind of counting on people just tuning out and forgetting about it and giving up. So I would really strongly encourage everyone to, continue to make your voice heard. And to Brad's point that, yes, form letters, government tends to ignore those. They're still important if you get those numbers up to a significant amount to draw media attention. But call your MPP. Call them constantly, get everyone else to call them, because they really do pay attention to that. Show up at their offices, that sort of thing. So, we're in this together, and there are organizations like Ontario Nature and Save Our Streams and Hamilton 350 to help out. So
Great. I'm going to give a quick follow-up because I know this question came up quite a bit during the Greenbelt grab. The, let's call it, complete erosion of the Ontario Endangered Species Act. Some people are asking, does the federal Endangered Species Act, does it have the power to supersede? And maybe you can kind of give the background on how that could possibly work.
yeah, it's a complicated question. The Federal Species at Risk Act was never really intended to operate that way, and has very, very rarely been applied on non-federal lands, because the expectation is that provinces have complementary legislation. That's no longer the case in Ontario. It is something we are actively asking with national partners what the federal government intends to do. It remains to be seen whether they will hold the line on Species at Risk Act. In the list of species, over 100 species that the province is removing from the provincial list, the reason for most of those is they're saying it's duplicative with federal protections. So the province is saying, well, it's the federal government's responsibility. So we are using that to now ask the federal minister, well, the province is saying it's your responsibility. What are you going to do? And there will be some more on that. I can't share the details right now, but there'll be some more on that, particularly coming that we're hoping to will be publicly available next week.
Excellent. That's good to hear. And in the past, as I understand, there was only 1 or 2 cases. One of them happened to be, I believe, in Quebec, where federal superseded provincial, if that's not correct.
There's a few like emergency orders and critical habitat orders that have been in place. One in Quebec for caribou, and then a few out west. We have seen a critical habitat order from last year from the federal government for red-side dace, which is an endangered fish species in the Greater Toronto Area. Present in a lot of the headwaters that would be significantly impacted by the proposal for Highway 413. So again, that requires the federal government to do something because there is a critical habitat order. And then there is a court case that went through last year that the federal government still has to respond to that would apply to all migratory birds. Basically, the court said that the federal government is not doing a good job at protecting migratory birds in compliance with its own legislation. So that is something that could lead to more changes at the federal level because the courts have already told them they have to.
Yeah, that's great. To kind of circle it back from a federal level, which, it's funny that you hear Ford essentially saying, yeah, sure, let the feds take care of it. And the first thing that will happen is they'll say, keep your nose out of your beds, right? So, but there was a couple of really great local points that I wanted to bring up. Michelle Tom said that, there were a lot of basements that flooded in Dundas last year with some heavy rains and floods. If you know one of these people, maybe, as you said, attending a political rally or whatever it is, this is the people that you need to reach out to if you know somebody that's had this happen, because it's very real for them. They understand and are able to talk directly to an MPP. They're able to talk directly to the media as well and say, listen, this happened to me and I can't afford for this to happen again. I don't want to deal with that again, and I need this protection, right? So please make sure you're pushing things with your friends, your relatives, etc., that went through this. Lisa, extremely important question I wanted to bring you away for many reasons, but because I know that the HDA is a good rapport with local Indigenous groups that have been, everything from some of the new installations that have gone on at the main Dundas Valley Park. Have you got any insight as to how or if Indigenous will be consulted on this?
Yeah, we only have the information, that the government has released, and they speak to Indigenous engagement and consultation. But I'm not aware of any direct outreach from the province. I mean, I attended some of the regional consultation sessions. I'm not sure who was invited, or I could see there were some municipalities, conservation authorities, but they didn't share with us who was invited and why to various regional sessions. I have heard from some of our Indigenous partners that we work with through the deer harvest. They've reached out and concerns. What does this mean? Does this mean in the future we're going to have to go to Toronto when we wish to do our deer harvest in the valley, and concerned about what this means? So I hope the province is doing their consultation and engagement.
and so essentially you're saying in everything you've been a part of since this announcement, you haven't seen essentially an organized outreach to them, and that people are from that communities are coming and asking you questions. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the government's not sharing with us who they're consulting with, other than inviting us to some of these sessions, which I believe have now wrapped up. I think there was 4 or 5 regional sessions, and we haven't heard anything else. I mean, the big thing was replying to the ERO by the end of December. I'm hoping everyone did see on our website, we did put out a letter. We tried to put it in very plain language, the issues and our position and how important it really is to contact your local MPPs and the minister and please share your concerns, because we are hoping they're going to listen and pause before they take anything further and really take a look at what are they looking to accomplish and why, and what is the best way to do this.
Excellent. I really appreciate that insight. I have a question here, and since you're right on the screen, Lisa, is this something where we start to even consider lobbying for, let's call it, expanded urban national parks? And just as a quick back story, Rouge is a great example of land that essentially would not have been protected in whole, even under strong local conservation authorities. So, when you have a large area of conservation land in Dundas, for example, which many people gifted, thinking it would be permanently protected, does it make sense to, run it up the ladder higher? Is this something that people are quote unquote starting to put in their hat to think about a bit more?
Great question. I mean, when you think of urban national parks, now we're getting to federal again and federal protections. Yeah. Look, I'm going to support any protection of green space, whether it's a national park, a provincial park, a conservation area, lands that the Bruce Trail Conservancy, anyone, Nature Conservancy of Canada. I think that's the key, is getting these lands protected that we want saved and conserved and preserved for the future and future generations. So whatever way we have to do it, I'm open to that. I'm not aware at this point, if the federal government is that one of their priorities right now, looking at new urban national parks. I'm not sure, to be honest.
Yeah, no, okay, but that does help to hear, the reality. Who doesn't want more protected land, right? Is I think what you're coming across with at the very least, and how we go about that is extremely important. I was going to jump over to Tony quickly and ask, with the research that Ontario Nature has been doing over the years, and then I'll bring this over to Brad afterwards. But, there are, let's be honest, lots of conservative supporting party people who are also concerned about their floods, who are also concerned about how their conservation area that they enjoy themselves could be treated as well. Are there specific areas, conservation areas, that are, let's call it, somewhat semi-mapped or that show strong conservative background that we should also be maybe looking at reaching out to have them also reach out to their local MTPs as a voting member, for instance? Have you guys been able to look at that deeper, Tony?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Greenbelt's an example of that. Like, it was constituents and voters of the conservative MPPs in those ridings that really kind of shifted the narrative a bit. And Ontario Nature is a charity, so nonpartisan organization. But if we look historically, that conservative governments have been good for the environment. It's in the word. Conserve is in the word, and like Ontario Nature has been around since 1931, formerly the Federation of Ontario Naturalists. A lot of our members and supporters are conservative voters. So I'm not really sure what the kind of disconnect is right now in terms of that kind of perspective and what we are actually seeing from the current government. But I know it exists. I know there's still a mentality within the Conservative caucus, and there's interest even from Minister McCarthy. I've seen him at events. I know he's a turtle lover. So we've been trying to raise with him, that some of the policies they're pursuing kind of contradict some of those values. So again, I think it's just reminding them, like, expanding protected areas in Ontario, this is something that's not a partisan issue. There is polling to support that over 80% of Ontarians want to see more natural areas and more parks and more protected areas. There's not many issues that 80% of people agree on anymore. So, again, I think it's just the more people have those conversations and remind them of kind of some of the true conservative values, it will only shift the narrative a bit more.
Yeah, there you go. And I'm glad you brought up, the fact that you have, and we do have, an overwhelming majority in terms of what people are willing to stand up for, and that's why we should not be worried or afraid of who we approach with these subjects. And the one really interesting I guess you could call it the point that I saw in here, that Antoinette Leone brought up, and Brad, I'll ask you this question. Are there any benefits to the amalgamation?
You could argue that there would be some benefits to the very small conservation authorities in the north and the east. By merging together with the conservation authority beside them, it would give them more resources for their area. But with the current Conservation Authorities Act and the current funding model, especially when the province of Ontario really has backed out of funding. Lisa was being kind when she said that the province gives us 1%. It's less than 1%. She doesn't like saying it, but it's true. It's approaching 0.75. Yeah, rounding error they call it. So is it possible? Yes. I can't lie that there might be some benefits to very small conservation authorities, but it is at the peril and loss of autonomy. That's the challenge. So if you merge a small conservation authority with a larger one, their autonomy is going to be eroded because of the way the boards would be set up. So it's important that we realize that. And to the earlier point about lobbying and whether or not the minister supports this or not, and he loves turtles and all that kind of stuff, I have to be very candid. As a former minister, I received mandate letters both at the Ministry of Transportation and at the Ministry of Labor. The Premier told me what to do. If I wanted to keep my job, then I had to work to achieve those goals. It is very rare, in my experience, for ministers to push back on a premier. So you need to get to the Conservative supporters and have them pushing on the premier, because he's the one that has a 62% approval rating right now, and he's the one that is always eyeing the populist sentiment. He is a populist. He can change his mind if he's getting inundated with emails and phone calls. I can give you one recent example. He started to get inundated with emails and phone calls from people in the GTA who were getting hit with many tickets from speed cameras. His government initiated speed cameras for municipalities. All of a sudden, he's getting emails and phone calls from people objecting to those penalties, and he reversed that decision. So I suggest that we really think about pushing the envelope. And the last thing I'd like to add, Peter, this all happened in the month of December. The general public does not know.
Yeah.
So conservative supporters don't know. They were out buying gifts. They were getting ready for Christmas. And so we need to push with open letters to newspapers and really drive the narrative, was Tony's comment. We need to drive the narrative as to how harmful this will be for the local autonomy of conservation authorities. Thank you.
Okay, that is wonderful. I know we're coming up to close to the end here. We had gone till 8:15 and we've gone beyond that. So yes, Kelly, getting conservatives and conservative MPPs and those that are voting there to go in the amalgamation is a very strong move. Public pressure is a very strong move. Many of the, let's just call it, people that live alongside, around this, enjoy these areas, have voted for this government, and that's why there were hundreds upon hundreds of people at the Ancaster Fairgrounds when the Green Bowl was brought to such a level. So we definitely need to stay on top of that, right? So if I think we're going to wrap this up. I've seen some great questions here. We are going to make sure that this is available to view after comments and questions, etc. will be recorded as well. I can't say enough thanks to Lisa, Brad, and Tony for giving their time. Robin as well, thanks for jumping in as well and giving us some more background. Most importantly, folks, as I told you earlier, we have a very simple but very strong, let's call it, way for us to go ahead and make that first step for 2026, because we already did this in 2025. Here it is. Fight back against the Conservation Authority merger, okay? February 1st, 2 to 3, just 1 hour of your time on a Sunday. And the reason we choose Sundays, just so you know, is that we have been told by the major media in Greater Hamilton that is going to be pretty much a guarantee that we will get time. We want to do it on a Wednesday at 12. They're a little bit busy usually. So this time we're on the other, let's call it, side of Greater Hamilton, Queenston and Nash, not too far from an MPP there as well. This is a great area that we had done this before. We will have sign making options there as well, so people can make their own signs. Bring your kids. We'll have food and coffee as well. And I just want to make sure that everybody understands that this will not be the last rally. There will be many, many more as we push through this. And I look forward to seeing everybody. Well, these were less than 2 weeks. We're 10 days away. And as Brad pointed out so clearly, they tried to hide this in December and put it in the coldest time of the year, busiest time of the year. Again, some people I saw in here said that we've got to be careful, a bit smarter after the last one at Greenbelt, but he's not going to outsmart us. So we're going to keep fighting and showing great numbers. So I look forward to seeing everybody at that meeting, and have a wonderful evening and rest of the week, and make sure your snow tires are on. Okay. All the best, everybody. Take care and wonderful rest of the week.